On December 19, 1944, a German submarine commander died in an Arizona prison camp with tears streaming down his face, not from pain or fear, but because for the first time in months, he could hear the ocean. What brought him to that moment began 10 weeks earlier, when the desert first tried to kill him with its silence. Papago Park prisoner of war camp sat in the Sonoran Desert 12 miles northeast of Phoenix, a collection of wooden barracks and guard towers surrounded by barbed wire and an emptiness that seemed to mock anyone who had ever known the sea. The compound covered nearly 700 acres of sand and dust, housing over 3,000 German prisoners by late 1944. These were not ordinary soldiers. Compound 1A held Kriegsmarine U-boat crews, Luftwaffe pilots shot down over North Africa, and decorated Afrika Korps officers, men who had been at the sharp edge of Germany's war machine before capture brought them to this alien landscape. For submariners especially, the irony cut deep. They had spent years in the claustrophobic steel tubes beneath the Atlantic, surrounded by water, hunting and being hunted through dark depths where pressure could crush a man in seconds. Now they found themselves in the driest place many had ever seen, where water was rationed and the horizon stretched away in browns and pale yellows instead of the endless blue-gray they knew as home. The camp's location had been chosen deliberately. Escape seemed impossible when the nearest border lay 150 miles south through desert that killed men faster than bullets. Werner Richter arrived at Papago Park on October 23, 1944, transported by military train from a processing facility in Virginia. He had been fished from the Atlantic 3 weeks earlier after his U-boat took a direct hit from a destroyer's depth charges northeast of the Azores. The boat went down in less than 4 minutes. Richter and 11 of his crew made it to the surface. By the time the American destroyer reached them, only 6 were still alive in the oil-slicked water. Korvettenkapitan Richter was 34 years old, a career naval officer who had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1932, when Germany was still forbidden from building submarines under Versailles Treaty restrictions. He had served on surface vessels until 1935, then transitioned to the expanding U-boat fleet. By 1944, he had commanded 3 different boats over 2 years, survived the increasingly deadly gauntlet of Allied anti-submarine warfare, and earned the Iron Cross First Class for sinking over 40,000 tons of merchant shipping. He was gaunt from years of poor rations, weathered from months at sea, and carried himself with the rigid bearing expected of a German naval officer even in captivity. The train journey from Virginia to Arizona had taken 5 days, passing through landscapes that grew progressively stranger to European eyes. Richter watched through barred windows as green forests gave way to plains, then to mountains, and finally to the desert that would become his prison. Other German officers in the transport car tried to maintain spirits with quiet conversation, speculation about the war's progress, careful avoidance of anything approaching defeatism. But Richter mostly stayed silent, watching the world transform into something he did not recognize. His first steps onto Arizona soil came in the afternoon heat of late October, when temperatures still reached 90 degrees despite autumn advancing elsewhere. The air hit him like a physical force, dry and hot and utterly devoid of moisture. It pulled water from his lungs with each breath. The dust rose in small clouds around the boots of prisoners being marched from the transport trucks to the processing building. It coated everything, fine and invasive, working into clothing and hair and the corners of eyes. Richter had experienced many hostile environments at sea, storms that threw boats around like toys, cold that froze spray instantly into ice that had to be chipped away or risk capsizing. But this was different. The ocean was alive, dynamic, powerful but honest in its threats. The desert felt dead, inert, hostile through absence rather than presence. The initial medical examination was routine. An American doctor, not the one who would later matter, checked teeth, listened to lungs, looked for signs of tuberculosis or other communicable diseases that might spread through the camp. Richter's file noted, prisoner in fair health considering recent combat stress and immersion trauma, some malnutrition consistent with U-boat service, lungs clear, but recommend monitoring for respiratory issues common in European prisoners adjusting to arid climate. The doctor spoke no German. Richter spoke minimal English. The examination proceeded through gestures and a board interpreter who had processed hundreds of prisoners and saw nothing remarkable in this one. Compound 1A consisted of 6 barracks arranged in 2 rows, each building housing 40 men in double-bunked berths. The structures were basic: wooden frames with tar paper roofs, screened windows without glass, and concrete floors that radiated heat during the day and cold at night. Richter was assigned to Barracks 3, given a lower bunk near the center of the building, and issued prison clothing, toiletries, and a thin blanket. The Geneva Convention mandated certain standards for prisoner treatment, and the Americans generally followed them. Officers could not be compelled to work. They received the same rations as American enlisted personnel. They could send and receive mail, though heavily censored. They were entitled to medical care. The German prisoners at Papago Park had organized themselves according to military hierarchy, maintaining discipline and structure even in captivity. Senior officers commanded respect. Morning formations were held voluntarily. Men kept themselves clean, uniforms such as they were kept orderly, and morale sustained through routines that gave days structure and purpose. Richter, as a decorated Korvettenkapitän, found himself among the informal leadership. Other U-boat men gravitated to him. He was known by reputation, a commander who brought boats home when so many others disappeared into the Atlantic without trace. But Richter found little comfort in this status. The desert oppressed him in ways that had nothing to do with captivity itself. At night, lying in his bunk while other men snored or whispered in the darkness, he stared at the ceiling and felt the wrongness of this place in his bones. He had spent years living with the ocean's constant presence, the roll of the deck, the smell of salt air, the sound of water against the hull even deep below the surface. That rhythm had become part of his heartbeat. Now there was only stillness, dryness, and silence that felt hostile in its completeness. Major Samuel Peterson was 31 years old, a medical officer from Portland, Maine, who had expected to spend the war at sea with the Navy, but had instead been assigned to Army Medical Services and posted to the desert he had never wanted to see. He was tall and lean, with the weathered hands of someone who had worked on boats before he worked on bodies. His father was a lobsterman out of Cape Elizabeth. His grandfather had been a fisherman before that, and the sea was in his blood the way it was for anyone raised on the Maine coast. Peterson had enlisted in 1942, shortly after Pearl Harbor, completing his medical training at Fort Sam Houston in Texas before expecting assignment to a hospital ship or naval base. Instead, the Army needed doctors for prisoner of war camps being established across the American Southwest. The reasoning made sense from a military logistics perspective. Put camps in isolated areas where escape was nearly impossible, far from coasts where enemy submarines might theoretically attempt rescues, in climates so foreign that prisoners would have no environmental knowledge to aid escape attempts. For Peterson, it felt like exile. He wrote letters home to his father describing the strangeness of living somewhere you could see 20 miles in any direction and never glimpse water. He tried to make light of it, joking about treating sunburn instead of frostbite, dealing with scorpions instead of nor'easters. But underneath ran a current of genuine displacement. He understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to be separated from the element that defined you. The camp infirmary was a separate building near the administrative complex, equipped to handle routine medical issues, minor injuries, and the sort of chronic health problems that arose in any population of 3,000 men living in close quarters. Peterson had 2 medical assistants, an orderly, and a rotating supply sergeant who managed medication and equipment. Serious cases got transferred to the Army Hospital in Phoenix. Everything else, he handled himself. Most medical issues were mundane: respiratory infections from dust, digestive problems from the change in diet, skin conditions from the dry climate, occasional injuries from work details or recreational sports the prisoners organized. Peterson treated everyone professionally, maintaining the distance appropriate between captor and captive. He spoke limited German, picked up gradually through repetition. Most prisoners spoke some English or could find someone to translate. The work was not challenging, but it was necessary, and he took the responsibility seriously. In his small private quarters adjacent to the infirmary, Peterson kept few personal possessions: a photograph of his parents standing on the dock in Portland, his father wearing the yellow oilskins of his trade, a handful of books, mostly medical texts, but also a worn copy of 2 years before the mast that had belonged to his grandfather, and a Webster Chicago wire recorder, one of the newer models that had become available to civilians and military personnel in 1943. The wire recorder was heavy, nearly 30 pounds in its portable case, using thin steel wire instead of magnetic tape to capture and play back sound. The technology was remarkable for its time. The ability to record audio and preserve it, play it back repeatedly without degradation. Peterson had purchased the unit in summer 1943 during a brief leave home before his deployment west, spending most of his savings on the device and its accessories. He had taken it to the places he knew he would miss, recording sounds he wanted to carry with him. The recordings were simple but precious. Waves breaking on the rocky beach at Cape Elizabeth, the specific rhythm of Atlantic surf against granite that was distinct from any other coastline, seagulls calling as they wheeled above the water, the foghorn at Portland Headlight, deep and mournful, wind moving through the coastal pines that grew almost to the water's edge. His father's boat, the Emma J., with its diesel engine chugging and the creak of rope against wooden cleats. These sounds had become Peterson's refuge during the long desert nights when sleep came slowly and homesickness felt like a physical ache. He played the recordings quietly, always at night, never where others might hear and think him sentimental or weak. But they mattered. They reminded him that the ocean still existed somewhere beyond this endless sand, that eventually this war would end, and he would return to the coast that had shaped him. The wire recorder was his most valued possession, a technological miracle that let him carry home in his pocket. The first weeks after Richter's arrival at Papago Park passed in the numbing routine that defined prisoner life. Morning formation at dawn, where American guards counted prisoners and German officers maintained their own internal discipline. Breakfast in the mess hall, thin coffee and oatmeal or occasionally powdered eggs. The long middle hours of the day with little to do except wait. Some prisoners organized classes, teaching languages or technical skills to pass time. Others exercised, formed sports teams, played cards. Officers received minimal work duties under Geneva Convention rules, so the days stretched empty and purposeless. Richter participated in these activities minimally. He was polite but distant, respected but not gregarious. Other submarine officers sought him out for conversation, sharing war stories carefully edited to avoid defeatism or criticism of the Reich. He listened more than he spoke, maintaining the reserve expected of a senior commander. But internally he was struggling with something he could not name and would not have admitted if he could. The dust was constant. It rose from the ground with every step, hung in the air during the frequent wind that swept across the desert, coated every surface no matter how frequently cleaned. It was fine, almost powder-like, working its way into everything. Richter found it in his food, in his clothes, in his bunk. He tasted it with every breath. Coming from a life at sea where salt spray and moisture were constant, the absolute dryness felt like suffocation. By the third week, he developed a cough. It started small, just a clearing of the throat, an irritation from the dust that everyone experienced to some degree. He ignored it. German officers did not complain about minor discomforts. The cough persisted, deepening slightly, but still seemed nothing serious. Many prisoners coughed. The desert affected everyone's lungs to some degree. By the fifth week, Richter noticed he was breathing more heavily during the morning calisthenics some officers maintained. His chest felt tight, as if the dry air could not fully expand his lungs. The cough had become regular, worse at night when lying down. He still did not report to the infirmary. To do so would be to admit weakness, to acknowledge that the desert was defeating him. He had survived depth charge attacks that shook his boat like a child's rattle, had breathed recycled air for weeks at a time underwater, had watched men die in the freezing Atlantic. He would not be broken by dust. By the seventh week in early December, he could no longer hide the deterioration. The cough was constant now, racking his frame. He had lost weight, his face gaunt and feverish. Night sweats soaked his clothing and blankets. Other prisoners noticed but said nothing directly, respecting his obvious desire for privacy. Then on the morning of December 4th, during the dawn formation, Richter swayed on his feet and collapsed. The American guards reacted immediately, two of them carrying the unconscious German officer to the infirmary, while the camp medical assistant ran ahead to alert the doctor. Peterson was shaving when the assistant burst in with the news. He grabbed his medical bag and hurried to the examination room where they had laid Richter on the table. The examination revealed what Peterson had seen too often among European prisoners in the desert camps: advanced pulmonary infection, likely pneumonia complicated by the combination of dust exposure and the dramatic climate change from sea-level moisture to desert aridity. Richter's lungs sounded congested when Peterson listened through his stethoscope, crackling with fluid. His fever ran at 103 degrees. His breathing was shallow and labored. His skin had the grayish cast that indicated serious oxygen deprivation. Peterson immediately began treatment with the tools available in 1944. Sulfa drugs, the primary antibiotics before penicillin became widely available, were administered through injection. Oxygen was provided through a mask connected to one of the infirmary's limited tanks. Fluids were pushed to counter dehydration. Cool compresses were applied to bring down the fever. Richter was moved to the infirmary's small ward, a room with 4 beds currently empty except for him. When Richter regained consciousness several hours later, his first response was anger. Through labored breathing and in heavily accented English, he demanded to be returned to his barracks, insisted he was fine, refused to accept the seriousness of his condition. Peterson had seen this reaction before, particularly among military officers who equated illness with failure. He responded with professional firmness. Richter was seriously ill. Without treatment, he would die. With treatment, he might recover. There was no shame in a body's limitations, only foolishness in ignoring them. Richter fell silent at that, his jaw tight with frustration but unable to argue with the obvious reality that he could barely breathe. Peterson completed his examination, noting in the medical file that prognosis was guarded, the infection was advanced, and even with proper treatment, recovery was uncertain. Then he left Richter to rest, checking back every few hours to monitor vitals and adjust treatment as needed. Over the next several days, Peterson maintained careful professional distance while treating the German officer. Their interactions were brief, clinical, limited to necessary communication about symptoms and treatment. Richter remained stoic when awake, refusing to show discomfort beyond what was physically unavoidable. He answered questions about his condition in monosyllables, asked for nothing beyond water, and stared at the ceiling with the blank expression of someone enduring what could not be changed. But at night, when fever rose and consciousness became unreliable, Richter's defenses fell away. Peterson, working night shifts to monitor the critical patient, heard the German officer talking in his sleep. Most of it was unintelligible, fevered mumbling in German too rapid and slurred for Peterson's limited vocabulary. But certain words recurred. Das Meer, die Wellen nach Hause. The sea, the waves, home. Peterson asked one of the German-speaking orderlies, a second-generation immigrant named Schmidt who had been drafted despite his heritage, to sit with him one night and translate if possible. They listened together as Richter thrashed in fever dreams, speaking to people not present. He called out orders to crew members, warning about depth charges, reporting damage. Then his voice would change, becoming younger, talking about Kiel Harbor, about sailing with his father as a boy, about the smell of salt air and the feel of deck rolling under his feet. And repeatedly, in moments of lucidity that punctured the delirium, Richter would whisper the same phrase. Ein Mann des Meeres sollte nicht im Staub sterben. Schmidt translated quietly, a man of the sea should not die in the dust. The words struck Peterson with unexpected force. He sat in the dim infirmary long after Schmidt left, watching the German officer struggle for breath, and felt something shift inside him. This was not just another prisoner, another enemy, another case number in a medical log. This was someone who understood exactly what Peterson felt every day in this desert exile, the specific suffering of being separated from the element that defined you. Peterson had grown up knowing that the ocean was not just a location, but an identity. His father had tried to explain it once, after Peterson had returned from his first season working on the boats during high school summer. The sea gets in your blood, Sam, his father had said while they mended nets on the dock. You can't wash it out. Some men try to leave, move inland, pretend they're something else, but it never works. The sea calls you home eventually, one way or another. Peterson had understood then, and he understood now, watching Richter die slowly in this place that was the antithesis of everything a man of the sea needed. The German officer was not just suffering from physical illness. He was being killed by displacement, by exile from his essential element, by the cosmic irony of surviving years of submarine warfare, only to be defeated by dust. The Geneva Convention outlined specific requirements for prisoner treatment. Medical care must meet the same standards provided to captor nations' military personnel. Prisoners must be treated humanely. Officers must be shown respect appropriate to their rank. These were the rules, the framework that supposedly civilized warfare. But they said nothing about compassion, about mercy that went beyond technical compliance, about the small kindnesses that acknowledged shared humanity even between enemies. Peterson struggled with his thoughts over the following days. Richter's condition was not improving. The sulfa drugs were having minimal effect. The infection had advanced too far, complicated by what appeared to be pre-existing damage to lung tissue from years of breathing recycled submarine air. Peterson's professional assessment was that the German officer had perhaps 2 weeks at most, possibly less. Death would come from respiratory failure, drowning in his own fluids, struggling for breath until the end. It would not be a good death. It would not be a death with dignity. It would be suffering in a place utterly foreign to everything Richter had been, surrounded by strangers who saw him only as an enemy, alone in every way that mattered. Peterson thought about his wire recorder, sitting in his quarters 30 feet away. He thought about the sounds captured on those steel wire spools, the ocean preserved and portable. He thought about what it would mean to break regulations against fraternizing with prisoners, to show what might be interpreted as favoritism or sympathy for an enemy officer. He thought about what his superiors would say if discovered, the potential disciplinary action, the questions about his loyalty and judgment. But mostly he thought about his father's words, about the sea getting in your blood, about being unable to wash it out. He thought about dying far from home, in a place that felt wrong in your bones, with no comfort except what strangers might offer. And he made his decision. The preparation took careful planning. Night shifts were minimally staffed, usually just Peterson and one orderly who spent most of his time in the administrative office doing paperwork. The infirmary ward where Richter lay was isolated, visible through a window from the office, but sound did not carry well. Guard patrols passed the building at irregular intervals but did not enter unless called. The risk of discovery was real, but manageable if he was careful. Peterson's day shift on December 18th was routine. He checked on Richter during morning rounds, noting the continued deterioration. The German officer was conscious but barely responsive, his breathing rapid and shallow, his fever persistent despite treatment. His eyes followed Peterson with awareness, but without hope. He knew he was dying. They both knew. There was nothing left to say about that. But Peterson said something anyway, leaning close so that Richter could hear him clearly despite the oxygen mask. "Tonight," Peterson said quietly in his limited German, "Ich bring das Meer. I bring the sea." Richter's eyes focused, confusion and question in them, but Peterson said nothing more. He completed his rounds, filed his reports, waited for the shift change. Evening came slowly, as it always did in the desert winter, the sun setting in spectacular colors that Peterson had learned to appreciate despite himself. He ate dinner in the officer's mess, forcing himself to eat normally, to show no sign of the transgression he planned. At 2200 hours, he returned to his quarters and carefully packed his medical bag with items he would need: stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, thermometer, medication, the usual tools. And underneath, wrapped in a towel to prevent damage, the wire recorder with its speaker and the spool containing his main coast recordings. The device was heavy but fit in the bag. He closed it, tested the weight, found it manageable. The night shift orderly was Corporal Williams, a kid from Ohio who mostly read comic books and drank coffee to stay awake during the boring hours. Peterson told him he was conducting an extended examination of the German patient and was not to be disturbed unless emergency. Williams barely looked up from his Captain Marvel comic, acknowledging the order with a distracted nod. Peterson carried his bag to the ward, closing the door behind him. Richter lay in the bed nearest the window, moonlight falling across his face. His eyes were closed, but Peterson could tell from his breathing pattern that he was not asleep, just resting in that semi-conscious state that conserved energy. The only sound was the hiss of oxygen and Richter's labored breathing. Peterson set the bag down carefully, removed the wire recorder, unwrapped it from the towel. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from the weight of what he was about to do, the recognition that this moment would matter in ways he could not fully predict. He plugged the device into the wall outlet, connected the small speaker, threaded the wire spool onto the mechanism. The wire was thin as thread, steel coated in bronze, carrying sounds captured thousands of miles away. He positioned the speaker on the small table next to Richter's bed, close enough that the sound would be clear but not loud enough to carry to the office where Williams sat reading. Then Peterson stood there for a long moment, his hand on the play lever, understanding that this was his last chance to change his mind, to maintain the distance that regulations demanded, to protect himself from the complications this mercy might create. But he thought of his father, of the sea in his blood, of dying alone in a place that felt wrong. He pressed play. The sound came through the speaker quietly, but in the silence of the infirmary, it filled the space completely. Waves rolling against rock, the specific rhythm of Maine coast surf that was different from any other ocean sound. Each wave building, cresting, breaking in a surge of white noise, then the retreat as water pulled back across granite only to return again. Eternal, rhythmic, the heartbeat of the ocean. Richter's eyes opened immediately. For a moment he looked confused, as if unsure whether he was dreaming or hallucinating from fever. His head turned slightly toward the speaker, and his expression changed completely. Recognition, disbelief, and something that might have been pain or joy or both twisted his features. "Das Meer," he whispered, his voice rough and barely audible beneath the oxygen mask. Peterson said nothing. He pulled up the small chair that sat in the corner and sat down beside the bed, watching the German officer's face. On the recording, seagulls began calling, their cries sharp and distinctive over the continuing sound of waves. A foghorn sounded in the distance, deep and mournful. Richter tried to speak but could not get words out. His breathing was hitching in a way that had nothing to do with the infection. His hands, which had lain limp on the blanket, moved to his face, pulling the oxygen mask aside despite Peterson's reflexive move to stop him. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, cutting tracks through the illness sweat. The Korvettenkapitän, the decorated U-boat commander, the proud German naval officer who had maintained rigid control even in captivity and dying illness, was crying like a child. His shoulders shook. His breath came in gasping sobs. The sound he made was raw and broken, all pretense of strength abandoned in the face of this unexpected mercy. Peterson watched, his own eyes stinging. He had expected some reaction, but not this, not the complete dissolution of every defense the man had built. It was painful to witness this naked vulnerability, this grief for everything lost and everything about to be lost. But it was also necessary. It was real. It was human. The recording continued. Waves and gulls and wind through coastal pines, rope creaking on wooden dock, the distant engine of a working boat. 30 minutes of sound captured on a summer afternoon in Maine, played back on a winter night in Arizona for a dying German who would never see the ocean again. Gradually, Richter's sobs quieted. He did not stop crying, but the intensity eased. He lay there with tears running down his face, listening to sounds he had feared he would never hear again. His breathing, though still labored from the infection, seemed slightly easier, as if something tight inside him had loosened. Peterson leaned forward and gently replaced the oxygen mask, wiping Richter's face with a clean cloth. The German officer's eyes met his, and there was understanding there, gratitude beyond words, recognition of what this gesture meant. "Thank you," Richter whispered in English, his accent thick, but the words clear. "This is home." "I know," Peterson replied quietly. "I'm from there, from the sea." They stayed in silence for a while, the recording playing on its 30-minute loop. When it ended, Peterson rewound the wire and started it again. The sounds returned. Waves, gulls, wind, the eternal voice of the ocean. "Where?" Richter asked, struggling with each word. "Where is this place?" "Maine. Cape Elizabeth. My home." Richter nodded slightly. "I am from Kiel, Baltic Sea. Different water, but..." He paused to breathe. "The same. We are the same. The sea made us." "Yes," Peterson agreed. "The sea made us. This place," Richter gestured weakly at the walls, the desert beyond. "It is wrong. For men like us. Wrong place to be. Wrong place to die," Peterson said, and Richter's eyes showed that he understood the deeper meaning. "A man of the sea should not die in the dust," Richter said in English, repeating his fevered German words in translation. "But tonight I am not in the dust. Tonight I am home." "Yes," Peterson said. "Tonight you're home." They talked little after that. Richter's strength was limited and every word cost him. But they sat together through the night, Peterson checking vitals occasionally but mostly just being present while the wire recorder played its loop over and over. Waves and gulls and wind. The sound of home for two men who had been born on opposite sides of the same ocean. Around 0300 hours, Richter drifted into something closer to real sleep than he had managed in days. His breathing remained labored, but his face had relaxed. The lines of pain and fear smoothed away. Peterson sat in the chair, occasionally dozing himself but always waking when the recording ended to restart it. He thought about what he was doing, about the absurdity of an American doctor spending his night playing ocean sounds for a dying German submarine commander, about how his superiors would view this if they knew, about whether it was foolish or dangerous or inappropriate. But mostly he thought about his father, about the simple truth that some things transcended nationality and politics and war. The ocean did not care about human conflicts. It had existed long before nations drew borders and would exist long after. Men who belonged to the sea shared something fundamental that went deeper than the temporary enmities that politics created. Tonight, in this small room in the middle of the desert, that deeper truth mattered more than the war outside. Around 500 hours, Richter woke again. Dawn was still an hour away, but the quality of darkness was changing. That subtle shift that happened before true light. The recording was playing its familiar loop. Richter listened for a moment, then turned his head slightly to look at Peterson. "My crew," he said with effort. 11 men made it to surface. 6 survived until your ship reached us. Do you know what happened to them? Peterson shook his head. "I don't have that information. They would have been processed at a different facility." Richter nodded slightly. "Good men. They deserved better than the Atlantic took them. Your boat went down fast?" 4 minutes. Depth charge ruptured the pressure hull. We had no chance to dive or maneuver. Just time enough to blow ballast and surface before she went under completely. You commanded how many boats? 3. 2 before were damaged but made it home. The third? Richter's voice trailed off. "You brought men home," Peterson said. "That's what matters. You kept them alive when you could." "Until I couldn't," Richter replied. There was no self-pity in his voice, just statement of fact. The Atlantic was winning by 1944. Too many Allied ships, too many aircraft, too many new detection methods. We went out knowing we would probably not return. Many boats disappeared with all hands. At least my men had the chance to survive. And you brought them up, got them to the surface. That took skill and courage. Richter almost smiled. Or perhaps foolish hope. Sometimes it is hard to know the difference. They fell silent again. The recording played on. Around 0530, Richter's breathing changed, becoming more difficult despite the oxygen. Peterson checked his pulse, found it rapid and weak. The end was coming, perhaps not immediately, but soon. Hours at most, possibly less. Richter seemed to sense it too. His next words came slowly with long pauses for breath. "I have a wife. In Kiel. Margaret. She will receive official notification that I died in captivity. But she will not know this. What you have done. She will think I died alone, in a terrible place, with no comfort." Peterson thought about that, about the woman in Germany who would receive the brief military telegram and would have to imagine her husband's final hours. What would you want her to know? That I was not alone at the end, that someone showed kindness, that I heard the ocean one last time. Richter paused, gathering strength. That an enemy became a friend. "I can't send mail to Germany," Peterson said. "Not during the war, and afterward. I won't have her address. I know, it is impossible, but I wish she could know." Peterson sat quietly thinking. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad and pencil he carried for medical notes. "Tell me about her. Tell me about Kiel. About your life before the war. I'll write it down, keep it. After the war, I'll try to find a way to let her know. I can't promise anything, but I'll try." Richter's eyes showed surprise and gratitude. For the next 30 minutes, speaking in short bursts between struggling breaths, he talked about meeting Margaret in 1936 at a naval officers' dance in Kiel, about their wedding in 1938, a small ceremony because he was junior officer without much money, about their apartment overlooking the harbor, where she would wait and watch when his boat came in, about how she understood that the sea owned part of him that she could never fully possess, but loved him anyway, about the letters they exchanged during his deployments, carefully censored but full of private meanings. About the son they had hoped to have someday after the war, who could choose his own path. Peterson wrote quickly, filling pages with notes he would later transcribe more carefully. He asked questions, drew out details, helped Richter build a picture of the life that was ending. It was more than a dying man's reminiscence. It was testimony, witness proof that this person had existed as more than an enemy, more than a casualty statistic. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside the window, Richter's voice grew weaker. The effort of talking was exhausting him, but he seemed determined to finish, to leave behind something more than military records and a grave in foreign soil. "The sea," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "It is strange. The ocean connects everything. All coasts, all nations. Water flowing from one place to another. Your main and my keel, they touch the same ocean. We are enemies because politicians say we must be. But the sea knows no borders. Men who belong to it are brothers regardless of what flags they fly." "Yes," Peterson agreed quietly. "The sea doesn't care about our wars. Tell Margaret that at the end, I was with someone who understood. Tell her I heard the ocean. Tell her—" He paused, breath rattling. "Tell her I was home." The morning shift change happened at 0600 hours. Peterson heard Corporal Williams leaving, replaced by the day orderly. He would need to leave soon, before questions were asked about why he had spent the entire night with one patient. But he remained a few more minutes, unwilling to abandon Richter now. "I should go," he said finally. "The day staff will be making rounds soon." "Danke," Richter whispered, "for this gift, for bringing the sea. I wish I could do more. You have done everything that matters." Richter's hand moved slightly, reaching out. Peterson took it, feeling the fever heat and weakness. "Mein Freund," Richter said. "My friend." "Yes," Peterson replied, his throat tight. "Friend." He carefully packed away the wire recorder, rewound the spool, wrapped everything back in the towel. The room felt suddenly empty without the ocean sounds, the silence heavy and oppressive. Peterson checked Richter's vitals one last time, adjusted the oxygen flow, made sure the German officer was as comfortable as possible. "The recording," Richter said. "Will you play it again, later?" "I'll come back tonight," Peterson promised. "I'll play it again." Richter nodded slightly, his eyes already closing. Peterson dimmed the light, picked up his bag, and left the ward. In the administrative office, the day orderly was preparing morning medication. Peterson filed a brief note in Richter's chart. "Patient's condition remains critical. Prognosis poor. Continue current treatment protocol." Nothing about the night he had just spent. Nothing about ocean recordings or shared humanity. Just clinical facts for official records. He went to his quarters, locked the door, and sat on his bed with the wire recorder beside him. His hands were shaking now that the adrenaline of the night was fading. He had crossed a line, broken regulations, shown mercy that would be difficult to justify if questioned, but he felt no regret. What he felt was grief, anticipating the loss of someone he barely knew but had come to understand completely. The day passed slowly. Peterson slept fitfully, woke to eat a meal he barely tasted, tried to occupy himself with routine tasks. He thought about Richter alone in the infirmary, about whether the German officer was awake or unconscious, suffering or peaceful. He thought about the promise he had made to return, to play the ocean sounds again. Evening came. Peterson ate dinner, waited for the shift change, prepared his bag again with the wire recorder hidden inside. The night orderly was Williams again, same routine as the previous night. Peterson told him the same story about extended observation, received the same distracted acknowledgement. In the ward, Richter looked worse than he had that morning. His breathing was more labored, his color grayer, his consciousness flickering. But when Peterson entered and set up the recorder again, Richter's eyes opened and showed recognition. Peterson pressed play without words. The waves returned, filling the room with the sound of home. Richter's face relaxed slightly. His breathing seemed to ease just a fraction. Peterson sat in the chair and settled in for another night vigil. They did not talk much this time. Richter lacked the strength, and Peterson saw no need to force conversation. The recording was enough. The presence was enough. Around midnight, Richter whispered, "Tell me about your father, the lobsterman." So Peterson talked quietly, describing his father's work, the daily routines of checking traps, the practical knowledge passed down through generations, the way his father could read weather in the sky and find productive waters by instinct. He talked about growing up on the docks, learning to tie knots and handle boats before he could properly read, about the smell of salt and fish and diesel that had been the smell of home, about why he had gone to medical school instead of following his father's trade, but how the ocean had never really let him go. Richter listened with closed eyes, occasionally nodding slightly. "Your father," he said at one point, "he is proud of you. Doctor instead of fisherman. Better life." "I think he was disappointed at first," Peterson admitted. "He never said so, but I could tell. He wanted me to take over the boat eventually, but he understood. The sea is hard. He wanted better for me. But you miss it. The life you did not choose. Every day," Peterson said quietly. "Especially here." "We are the same," Richter said again. "Men out of place. The sea calls, but we cannot answer." The hours passed. The recording played its endless loop, waves and gulls and wind. Richter drifted in and out of consciousness, his body slowly failing. Peterson monitored his vitals, noting the gradual decline, pulse growing weaker, more irregular, breathing becoming more labored despite maximum oxygen, the skin taking on the pallor that indicated the final stage. Around 500 hours, Richter opened his eyes one last time. The dawn was coming again, the sky beginning to lighten. The recording was playing, waves breaking on distant Maine rocks. Richter looked at Peterson with complete clarity, lucid in the way that sometimes happens at the very end. "Thank you," he said in English, each word distinct, "for seeing me, not as enemy, as man." "Thank you," Peterson replied. "For the same." "The ocean waits," Richter whispered. "For both of us. Eventually." "Yes, eventually we all go home." Richter smiled slightly, the first genuine smile Peterson had seen. "Home," he repeated. Then his eyes closed. His breathing changed, and 40 minutes later, at 05:47 hours on December 19th, 1944, Korvettenkapitän Werner Richter stopped breathing. Peterson sat motionless for several minutes, listening to the recording play on, waves continuing their eternal rhythm while the man who had found such comfort in them lay silent. Then he slowly stood, turned off the oxygen, checked for pulse and found none, noted the time in his mind. He reached out and gently closed Richter's eyes, then stood by the bed in silence. The recording ended. Peterson did not restart it. He packed away the wire recorder, wrapped it carefully, placed it in his bag. Then he went to the office and informed the orderly that the German prisoner had expired, to prepare the necessary paperwork and contact the appropriate officials. The official death certificate listed cause of death as pneumonia secondary to pulmonary infection, with contributing factors of environmental exposure and pre-existing lung damage. Time of death, 0547 hours, December 19, 1944. Attending physician Major Samuel Peterson. The report was filed with camp records, sent to the Army's Prisoner Affairs Office, and would eventually be transmitted through neutral channels to German authorities, and ultimately to a woman in Kiel named Margaret Richter. But none of those official records mentioned the ocean sounds or the tears, or the friendship that formed in the space between enemy and human. Those details existed only in Peterson's memory and in the notes he had written during Richter's final hours. The German prisoners in Compound 1A held a small memorial service 3 days later. The Geneva Convention allowed such observances for deceased officers. The men gathered in formation, stood at attention while a senior officer spoke briefly about duty and sacrifice, and the hope that Korvettenkapitän Richter had found peace. They sang "Ich hat einen Kameraden," the traditional military song for fallen comrades. The American guards watched from a distance, respectful but separate. Peterson observed from near the administrative building, not attending but present. He watched the German officers standing rigid in their prison uniforms, maintaining dignity and honor for their dead. He wondered if any of them knew how Richter had really died. In what manner? With what comfort? Probably not. It was not something he could explain or justify to them. That night in his quarters, Peterson sat at his small desk and began writing a letter he knew he could not send yet. "Dear Frau Richter," it began, "you do not know me, and I cannot reach you while our countries are at war. But I write this now, so that someday, if possible, you will know how your husband died, and what his last hours were like. He wrote carefully, describing the care Richter had received, the respect he had commanded, the courage he had shown. He wrote about the ocean sounds, about why he had made that choice, about how Richter had responded. He wrote about their conversations, about what Richter had said about his wife and his home in the sea. He wrote everything he thought she would want to know, everything that would ease the pain of imagining worst scenarios. When he finished, the letter was 5 pages long. He read it over, made small corrections, then folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope without address. He wrote on the outside, "To be sent to Margaret Richter, Kiel, Germany, after cessation of hostilities if possible." He put the envelope in his footlocker, beneath his uniforms, where it would stay safe until circumstances allowed him to fulfill his promise. The wire recorder sat on his desk next to the letter. Peterson looked at it for a long moment, then carefully removed the spool containing the Maine coast recordings. He labeled it in ink, "For Werner Richter, Korvettenkapitän, who returned to the sea, December 1944. The war continued. Papago Park continued housing prisoners. Peterson continued treating the routine ailments and injuries that filled his days. But something had changed in him, some certainty about what mattered and what did not. He had entered the war believing in clear categories: enemy and ally, us and them, right and wrong. He still believed in those categories in the abstract sense. But he had learned that individual humans were more complicated, that mercy was not weakness, and that some things transcended the temporary conflicts nations created. In April 1945, news reached the camp that President Roosevelt had died. In May, word came that Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The prisoners at Papago Park received the news with mixed emotions: relief that the killing had ended, fear about what awaited them in a defeated Germany, uncertainty about their futures. Repatriation would take time, processing and transportation for thousands of prisoners. Peterson remained at the camp through the transition period, continuing his medical duties as the prisoner population slowly decreased. The men left in groups, transferred to other facilities, or eventually shipped back to Germany. The camp that had held over 3,000 at its peak dwindled to hundreds, then dozens. In November 1945, Peterson received his discharge orders. The army was demobilizing millions of men, sending them home now that victory was achieved. He would return to civilian life, to Maine, to the coast he had missed for 3 years. He packed his few possessions carefully, including the wire recorder and the letter he had written 10 months earlier. Before leaving, he made one final visit to the camp cemetery, where prisoners who had died during captivity were buried. Richter's grave was marked with a simple wooden cross, his name and rank and dates carved into the wood. Peterson stood there in the desert heat, looking at the marker and thinking about the man beneath it, the man who had died so far from the ocean he loved. "I kept my promise," Peterson said quietly to the grave. "I'm going to find her. I'll make sure she knows." He returned to Portland, Maine in December 1945, arriving home to find his father older, but still working the Emma J, still checking traps every morning, weather permitted. They embraced on the dock and his father said, "You look different, Sam. The desert changed you?" "Yes," Peterson said simply. "It changed me." He did not immediately resume his medical practice, taking time instead to readjust to civilian life, to the coast, to peace. He spent January and February of 1946 recording new ocean sounds with his wire recorder, walking the beaches and rocky shores of Cape Elizabeth, capturing the surf and wind and gulls. He was making new recordings, but he kept the spool labeled for Richter separate, preserved exactly as it had been that night in the infirmary. In March 1946, international mail service to Germany was partially restored, though the country was in ruins and the postal system unreliable. Peterson began the process of trying to locate Margaret Richter. He wrote to the International Red Cross, to German naval archives, to anyone who might help him find a woman in Kiel whose husband had died in an American prison camp. It took 6 months, but in September 1946, he received a response. Margaret Richter had been located. She was alive, living in the British occupation zone, working as a translator for the military government. The Red Cross provided an address where mail might reach her, though they cautioned that delivery was uncertain in post-war Germany. Peterson sent the letter he had written nearly 2 years earlier, along with a shorter new letter explaining who he was and why he was writing. He did not know if it would reach her, or if she would respond, or if the whole effort was futile. But he had made a promise to a dying man, and he would keep it. 3 months later, in December 1946, a response arrived. The envelope was thin, the paper cheap, the handwriting elegant despite being written with what appeared to be poor ink. Peterson opened it carefully and read, "Dear Dr. Peterson, I received your letter about my husband Werner, and I write to thank you from my heart. You cannot know what it means to learn that he was not alone at the end, that someone showed him kindness, that he heard the ocean one last time. The official notification told me only that he died in captivity of illness. I have spent 2 years imagining terrible things, believing he suffered alone in a foreign place with no comfort. Your letter has given me peace I thought I could never have. Werner loved the sea more than anything except perhaps his family. He used to say that the ocean was in his blood, that he could not imagine dying anywhere but on or near water. To know that you brought the sea to him in that desert place, that he heard waves and gulls before the end, this is a gift beyond price. You gave my husband dignity and peace in his final hours. You saw him as human, not as enemy. For this, I will be forever grateful. The war took so much from everyone. It made enemies of people who might have been friends. But your action showed that humanity can survive even in war, that mercy can cross battle lines, that the essential things that make us human are stronger than the political forces that divide us. I thank you for keeping your promise to Werner. I thank you for writing to me. And I thank you for proving that even in the darkest times there are people who choose compassion over hatred. With deepest gratitude, Margaret Richter." Peterson read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in an envelope with the letter he had written to her and Richter's original information. He put them all in a box, along with the wire recorder spool, and stored the box in his closet. These items were private, personal, not for public display or discussion. They were the record of a night in the desert when 2 men found brotherhood across enemy lines, when the ocean proved stronger than war. Years passed. Peterson reopened his medical practice in Portland, married a woman who had waited for him through the war, had children who grew up on the same docks where he had learned to love the sea. He never spoke publicly about Richter, never told the story except to his wife in private, and eventually to his children when they were old enough to understand. But he never forgot. Every December 19th, he would take out the box, reread the letters, remember the German submarine commander who had died listening to ocean sounds in an Arizona desert. He would play the recording quietly in his study, listening to the waves and gulls and wind, remembering what it had meant to 2 men displaced from their element. In 1963, Peterson made a trip to Germany, ostensibly for a medical conference but really to visit Kiel. He looked up Margarete Richter, found that she had remarried, had built a new life after the war. They met for coffee in a cafe overlooking the harbor where Werner had once served. She was older, gray-haired but still elegant, still carrying herself with dignity. They talked for hours, sharing memories of a man they had both known in different ways. She told him about Werner's early career, about their life together before the war, about the letters he had sent from sea. Peterson told her about the final nights, about what Werner had said, about how he had found peace at the end. When they parted, Margaret took Peterson's hands and said, "Werner always said that men of the sea were brothers, regardless of nationality. Thank you for proving him right. Thank you for being his brother when he needed one most." Peterson returned to Maine carrying that benediction, that validation of the choice he had made 20 years earlier in a desert infirmary. He had broken regulations, risked discipline, crossed lines that military propriety demanded remain inviolate. But he had done the right thing, the human thing, the thing that honored what was best in both men. Samuel Peterson died in 1989 at the age of 76, in his home overlooking Casco Bay. His family found the box in his closet after his passing, discovered the letters and the wire recorder, and the story they told. They donated the materials to the Maine Maritime Museum, where they remain as testament to an unlikely friendship born in the crucible of war. The wire recorder spool, carefully preserved, can still play its recording of Maine coast sounds captured in 1943. Visitors to the museum can listen to the same waves and gulls and wind that Werner Richter heard in his final hours, can imagine what it meant to a dying man to receive that gift of home. The story raises questions about duty and mercy, about following rules and following conscience, about whether compassion for enemies constitutes betrayal or represents the highest form of loyalty to what we claim to fight for. There are no easy answers, but the facts remain. In December 1944, an American doctor brought the ocean to a German submarine commander dying in the desert, and in that moment, they proved that humanity could survive even the most dehumanizing circumstances humanity creates. Werner Richter, Korvettenkapitän, died far from the sea he loved, in a place utterly foreign to everything he was. But he did not die alone, and he did not die without comfort, and he did not die without dignity. A man of the sea should not die in the dust, and because of Samuel Petersen's compassion, Werner Richter did not. That night, and for those final hours, he was home. If this story of compassion across enemy lines touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these powerful, forgotten stories of humanity in the midst of war to light. Hit the like button to show your appreciation for the courage of both Major Petersen and Korvettenkapitän Richter, two men who proved that our shared humanity is stronger than the conflicts that divide us. And please, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed or experienced an act of compassion that transcended difficult circumstances? Do you know similar stories from history that deserve to be remembered? Your comments create a community of people who believe that even in the darkest times, mercy and kindness matter. Thank you for watching, for remembering, and for keeping these stories alive. The ocean connects us all, just as Petersen and Richter discovered that December night in 1944.